I'm going to talk about the basics of composting, why composting works, some different types of composting, and dig a little bit deeper into what's going to be most appropriate for primarily for smaller farms and gardens, and then have some time for Q&A. So first, I want to just put compost kind of in context and in relation to other kinds of materials that we use as organic amendments for soil. And that is primarily how we should think about compost. It is a slow release fertilizer, but it's primarily an amendment to improve the overall quality of soil. So other kinds of materials that are used as organic amendments would be crop residues. So the straw or straw would be the residue from wheat, or in a garden, you'll have things like broccoli stalks. Those materials have some nutrients in it, not a very high quantity, but they break down relatively quickly over a few weeks to months. And they will have some effect in improving overall soil health. So things like the tilth and the overall darkness of soil. Crop residues are very important, though, because they are something that's produced every year from land that's in use. And so even though you know, they don't have a high nutrient content, those nutrients are really important to continually get back into the soil. Another kind of material that we use as organic amendment would be livestock manures, any kind of animal manures. Those are much higher in nutrient content and do also improve soil health, although more so in the short term than in the really long term. Another really different material some people are using would be peat. That's a mined high organic matter material. But while it has a lot of carbon in it, it has very little nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And it does have soil health benefits, definitely can loosen up soil, make it feel a lot lighter, easier to work with, but it will break down over time. So compost, in relation to the rest of these, it has sort of a moderate amount of nutrients, generally not as high as manures, but the nutrient released from compost is going to be quite slow, and we'll talk more about that later. So the nutrients are usually released over a course of several years. What's really great about compost as a soil amendment, though, is that it has great benefits to broader soil health, to improving the biological activity in soil, and the tilth and workability, and those benefits tend to last quite a long time from compost, on the order of decades of improvement. So what is composting? Well, it is a type of decomposition. So any types of decomposable organic raw materials can be used, but it's really a transformational process. We transform those raw organic materials biologically, chemically, and physically into something that looks really substantially different than what we started with. So while this is decomposition, which is kind of similar to what happens in topsoil, so when any dead plant matter falls to the earth, or a dead animal falls to the earth, there's a pretty rapid decomposition of that material through the microorganisms, and also through things like beetles that will feed on that and help it to break down. So it's somewhat similar to any other kind of decomposition, but in composting, we're doing it in a concentrated large mass. And because of that, and because we're doing some other things to manage the process, it gets hot, which is very different than what you would ever see in a topsoil. And it goes a lot faster, that decomposition decomposition goes faster. So by providing really intensive food sources and great management for microbial activity, we produce this heat and actually rely on a class of microorganisms that are heat-loving or thermophilic. So composting really is a biological process. And again, our organic raw materials, we call those feedstocks in composting. They're transformed because microorganisms are feeding on them. In order for those microorganisms to be active, they need not just that food, but they have to have some air and water. We want to, in composting, we want to promote aerobic organisms. So they're breathing oxygen similar to we do. And of course, we are bringing in microorganisms in the organic materials themselves. And microorganisms are all around us all the time. So generally, we don't have to bring those in on purpose. But when we give them great food and a great environment, they go into a feeding frenzy. So we're talking about billions of microorganisms that are active in every little pinch of that material. And because we are doing composting in a large mass of material, that turns out to be a really important part of it. The mass itself is necessary to insulate what's happening in the center of the pile. And when you have enough microbial activity that produces heat, and then the outside of the material insulates that heat. So some of that heat is going to be released, but if you have enough material, then enough of the heat is stored inside and increases the temperature substantially. Throughout that process, we're also releasing carbon dioxide. So again, the respiration is very similar to what we do. We breathe in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. But when we have billions to trillions of microorganisms doing this, we convert that material into compost with high amount of humic acids and less carbon. So about half of the original carbon is actually released as carbon dioxide, the CO2. So I mentioned that the high temperature is an important part of composting. This is the temperature profile that we will see in material that has enough food in it and enough water and enough air. And as long as we're not disturbing the material too much. So if we have this fairly smooth temperature increase, which usually happens over a few days to a few weeks, and then gradually over time, that temperature is going to decline. Where the temperature is highest, we call that the active phase. So clearly that's when the microorganisms are most active, just eating that food stuff. And again, because we have enough material, the temperature actually increases. There's a critical temperature range that we want to reach for composting. And very often, small scale composting, like in backyards, doesn't actually reach this critical temperature. But in commercial facilities, in any facility that's going to make compost that's sold, they have to reach this high temperature range where we actually do have the activity of these thermophiles, these heat-loving microorganisms. And that critical level is 130 Fahrenheit. So legally, compost has to reach at least 131 Fahrenheit for at least 3 days. And what's happening here is it's a bit similar to if our bodies have a virus. you can think of the potential pathogens coming in these dead plant materials or in manures. You know, those things are going to carry some pathogens and weed seeds. And you can think of those sort of as the virus coming in. Well, the system is going to heat up to try to break down those pathogens. And at a higher than normal temperature, those pathogens do die off. We don't want to get too high though, or eventually we also kill off the organisms that we do want, which are the thermophiles. So that range between about 130 Fahrenheit and 165 is where we get very high activity overall and pathogen die-off. Overall, this is called a PFRP, and I'll kind of rattle that off once in a while. So just so you know what PFRP is, it's a process to further reduce pathogens. And so this is something that every commercial or permitted composting facility has to go through. But even for backyard gardeners and for small farms, it's a really good thing to have in mind, because you should be aiming to meet a PFRP, even if you don't legally have to, because it gives you these benefits of breaking down pathogens and weed seeds. So it's a combination of heat and time, depending on your type of management. So again, we want to reach at least 131 Fahrenheit, and in most systems, that's for at least 3 days. 3 days in a row. If you're in a turned system where you're turning that every couple of days, you actually should be meeting that 131 repeatedly over a 15-day period and turning at least 5 different times. Commercial facilities also have to go through annual microbiological testing and some other things like metals testing, which of course gardeners and small farmers aren't required to do. I will mention though that there are very few analysis labs around the country that are really thoroughly trained to analyze compost. And one of them is in Washington State, the Soil Test Farm Consultants in Moses Lake. So again, composting is really about creating this great environment for maximal microbial activity. And these are the main factors that we can control to ensure that great environment. We're going to talk about the C to N ratio, that C:(N). That means the amount of carbon and the amount of nitrogen in relationship to each other. So all organic materials, including us and plants, all these things have carbon and nitrogen, but in very different ratios to each other. And we want to combine different materials so that overall we have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25 to 30 to 1. And don't worry, we'll talk more about C to N ratios. We also need a lot of moisture. The total mass of the material needs to be about half water, or even a little bit more than half water, which is more than a lot of people think it should be. But really, to get active composting, you need to monitor the moisture and really make sure that it stays quite moist, so that it's not quite dripping wet, but that it's clearly moist all the time. Oxygen is something that commercial facilities will actually monitor that, but for us, it's more something that we need to keep in mind, that the microorganisms we want, again, they're breathing all the time. And if they're eating very fast, that means they're going to be breathing really fast too. We don't want them to run out of oxygen. So the way we ensure that is primarily by just making sure that there's enough porosity in the material that air can continually move through. We can also supplement the air, and again, we'll look at some ways to do that later. And the pH. Again, this is something that commercial facilities will measure and monitor, but just something for individuals to keep in mind. You want a fairly neutral pH, meaning things that aren't overly alkaline, things that aren't overly acidic. So for instance, it can be just hard to compost something like a pile of citrus peels. Now, most of us aren't dealing with odd things like that. You know, generally speaking, our materials are going to be at a neutral pH. So this carbon to nitrogen ratio, let's spend some time looking at this. We can compost all kinds of organic materials, and a few of those are going to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio that's close to ideal for composting. So these materials in the middle, like cow manure, horse manure, soured hay, you know, those are sort of in the range of that 25-30 to 1 that are optimum for composting. But there's lots of things that we can still compost that are like wheat straw. You know, that may have a carbon to nitrogen ratio more like 80 to 1 or 100 to 1, clearly way off base from our ideal. But we can also compost things like chicken manure and fish scraps, which have relatively a lot more nitrogen. So often in composting, we're combining multiple different materials so that we're providing overall a balanced meal for these microbes. So there are various terms that you'll see applied to different kinds of feedstocks. This set on the top, the fish scraps, chicken manure, grass clippings, those you might see those called energy materials or high nitrogen, because there's always more carbon than nitrogen. So those materials on top, they have high nitrogen, which is actually a low C to N ratio. I know that can get a little confusing. So we often call those energy materials or even greens, because for plants, usually they'll be the green materials that have high nitrogen. Again, in the middle, we have these more balanced materials that may compost well on their own. And then there are lots of bulking materials, which are also often brown or tan, things like straw and leaves and wood. Those materials, even though they don't carry with them a lot of nitrogen or a lot of nutrients overall, they can be very important in bulking and, again, allowing that porosity throughout your compost pile. So we talk a lot about the carbon and nitrogen because those are really such critical building blocks for the microorganisms. You know, these microbes, they're eating these feedstocks because they need the nutrients in it and they need the energy that they can derive from it. The carbon is mostly used for energy, and some of it's incorporated into their bodies. And the nitrogen is mostly incorporated into their bodies as proteins. Nitrogen can cause problems if it's either too high or too low. If there's not enough nitrogen, or if nitrogen is limiting, what you often see is a slow, really slow composting. So for instance, if you try to compost, you know, just wood chips, it often doesn't get very hot, or it takes longer. It'll go a lot faster if you also have some fresher leaves chopped up with it. But if the N is limiting, the microbial populations tend to just take longer to build up, and therefore the decomposition goes slower. If there's too much nitrogen, So you're trying to compost things like just fish waste on its own. You're likely to lose a lot of that excess nitrogen as things like ammonia gas, and nobody likes to smell that. It's actually dangerous to breathe. And that nitrogen loss can cause lots of environmental problems, and it's just a waste of nutrients. So let's talk about some different types of composting: passive, aerated, turned, home composting, and vermicomposting. So the most common type for the backyard or for small farms is what we call passive composting. This means you gather all your materials up, do the best job you can to balance out that carbon nitrogen ratio, give some porosity, and then you let it sit. So with this, we definitely should see that temperature rise. It'll stabilize for a while and then slowly drop off as the microorganisms have used up most of the goodies in the middle. This is the easiest way to do it, requires minimal management, but it can give you inconsistent results. So on the downside, once you've built that pile, if you're not doing things like checking the temperature, checking the moisture, digging in there once in a while to see if it's getting hot, if it's moist, or if it just smells anaerobic in there, if it smells putrid, then you can get inconsistent results. Something like composting within a bin also is a passive style, although there are some advantages to putting the material within a bin. Gives you a bit more insulation and protection from things like neighborhood dogs. So let's talk about some ways that we can improve the consistency and quality of compost. There are various ways of doing aeration for composting. One of the easiest ways is to include perforated pipe. And so perforated pipe can be purchased at any like home improvement store. It's used in plumbing, like for drain fields. And so those perforated pipes, what you do is have at least one end of that pipe that's open to the outside air. And then most of the pipe is underneath or within the composting material. What happens is, as the material starts heating up, as we saw, that heat starts rising from the middle of the pile and actually starts drawing air in through the perforated pipe from the outside. So it creates like this chimney effect, drawing fresh air and oxygen into the material. And so what you see here is, those perforated pipes are laid down near the ground. You can also do this in a vertical style, so that the end of the perforated pipe is sticking up through the middle, or you can have, if it's a large pile, you can have a perforated pipe, for instance, every square foot to aerate the material. Or you can take a more active approach and use a blower system where you're actually pushing air out throughout the pile. So again, we have this increase in temperature and then the decrease. And I wanted to point out, though, that even as that temperature starts to decline, there can still be very important microbial activity happening. So your active, really hot phase is likely to only be, it may even be only a couple of days, but it's more likely to be a couple of weeks. If you're lucky, maybe a month. But then that temperature will decline. It doesn't mean that microbial activity has stopped. They've just moved on to more complicated foods and to different parts of the pile. Now, you can also do turned composting. Now, clearly, these are large equipment that are shown here. front-end loaders or commercial scale compost turners. But you can do turned composting on a smaller scale with more physical labor, or with smaller tractors and smaller front-end loaders. And turning is a great way to also bring in more oxygen to the pile and just to help break up the material physically. It also ensures that all of the material is at some point getting hot. One of the problems that we have in the more passive styles is that outer crust of material tends to just dry out and not decompose very much. With this turning, again, it is much more likely that all the material is going to be in that hot center at some point. And when we have a turned system, then we see a quite different temperature profile if you are watching that consistently. So every time you turn, you're releasing a lot of heat out of the center. Again, the benefit is you're adding oxygen, but you're losing some heat. Now, the first couple of times that you do that, you're likely to see the temperature bump back up to a similar temperature as you got the first time. And eventually, though, you'll get less and less and less of a temperature bump until there's very little to none. That another advantage then of doing some turning is that it tells you if the composting is essentially finished and if the curing time has begun. During that curing, you'll have a lot more fungi and actinomycetes moving in, so you'll tend to start seeing more white hyphae in the material. And those organisms are really good at breaking down the more woody materials. Okay, so in the backyard composting style, or on small farms, again, you're not likely to have just one material going into your compost. You'll have multiple. So what you'll try to do is layering of high nitrogen material and high carbon material. And again, you can think of these as just your greens and your browns. So those greens are the high energy, high nitrogen materials, and they do tend to be green. So grass clippings, even green leaves, or fresh waste from the garden. So for instance, those broccoli stalks are a green waste. If you do have chickens, for instance, even though chicken manure isn't really green, it is a high nitrogen material and would be considered as part of that green layer. The browns are often easier to come by. So those are going to be the more dried out or senesced materials like leaves and landscaping wastes. So the easiest way to do home composting is to layer those greens and browns approximately 1-to-1. Now, keep in mind that if you're doing things this way, the likelihood is that, we don't have any kind of precise measurements on how much nitrogen is in there or the C to N ratio. We may not be monitoring the water very, very closely. And so it is likely to be a slower process, but it will still decompose over time. So you do want to at least check the moisture a few times during the process so that it does stay moist. And basically, the more active you can be in the management, the faster that process is going to go, because you're continually making sure those microbes have what they need. But even if you go through a really slow process like this, within a year to a year and a half, the center bottom of that pile is going to look like compost. It'll be dark and crumbly, and you can use that material in your flowers or garden. And then what's uncomposted on the top and the outsides, you can simply start that in a new compost pile. So some things that we don't recommend for the home composter or very small scale, and sorry, dead animal picture here, that's distressing. But we don't recommend that, new composters are working with things like carcasses or even pet wastes, meat or dairy, or herbicide treated trimmings. Primarily because on the small scale, you're not likely to reach that high temperature PFRP. And also because on the small scale and at your homes, there's likely to be more human contact and pet contact with that material before it's fully broken down. So there's a couple questions here. So what is the thick, oily goo that seeps out of the bottom? All right, so if you have thick, oily goo seeping out, that's likely to be, if it's dark, there's probably humic matter in it. So that shows that there has been some decomposition, and yeah, so there has been decomposition. It may be too wet. It sounds like it's probably overall high nitrogen material, and you would benefit from having a base material of some things like wood shavings to absorb that in. And also to balance out what kind of thermometer. Ideally have at least 1 foot length. So, and if you have a small pile, you'll probably only need about 1 foot to get into the center of the pile. With a large pile, you can go up to about a 3 foot stem length on a stemmed thermometer. And what's the smallest size, right? Okay, lots of questions coming in. So smallest size, I'll get to that. Can chicken manure be composted with the bedding? Yes, that tends to be an excellent blend, in fact, because the chicken manure itself is high in nitrogen, whereas the bedding is usually high in carbon. Recommendations for enhancing the composting. Yep, I think I'm going to get to that next question. Okay, great questions coming in. All right, so just some caveats there. We don't recommend that you start composting, for instance, carcasses or even meat and dairy products until you've done some easier materials. So yeah, in the very small scale, again, you can do very passive, just freestanding. You can build or buy all kinds of bins or rotators. So in order to have any hope of reaching that PFRP, you need at least a cubic yard of material. So if that's in an open pile, that means that it's going to be about 5 feet in diameter around the base, and then angle up to a peak at about 3 feet high. And you'll be much better off if you have really at least 2 cubic yards. With less than that, you're just not going to get enough insulation. If you use a solid bin, like the rotating bins tend to be, that does give extra insulation and definitely helps with that increase of temperature. Those enclosures also, again, help to just keep the dogs out of the material. Okay, that question goes to the next one. On ivermectin, yep. Yeah, I don't really address that later. So, yeah, so there are animal drugs that can survive the composting process. And this goes for herbicides and pesticides also. So most of those things are broken down in composting, but it's not a guarantee. And it really just comes down to specific compounds, how well they're going to break down or not. For instance, glyphosate, Roundup breaks down pretty well in composting. On the other hand, there are two herbicides have been very problematic. Clopyralid and picloram are the active ingredients. And those have been found to, you can feed a horse hay that's been treated with picloram. The compound survives the gut of the horse, comes out in the manure, compost the manure, and the finished compost still has active picloram in it and will kill your garden. So yes, watch out for herbicides in your residues and wormers also, like ivermectin, parasite killers, say it the easy way, like ivermectin. Those, I can't guarantee that those fully break down. And there have been cases where effective doses of worm killers are in compost, and they can actually affect the earthworms in soil. So yes, you do want to be careful with using chemicals in your landscape and on your farm that may survive the composting process. Okay, yeah, so just to move on a little bit, there are lots of different ways that you can build bins to help to insulate the compost. Just, I really recommend that you do make a structure that's still easy to access, so that you are encouraged to go through that material once in a while, mix it up, check the moisture. So again, most home composting is going to be a cool process, and some evidence of that is that you'll see more meso and macroorganisms. You'll have worms, centipedes, mites. Those are an indication that it's not super hot in that material. So to speed things up, there are some things that you can do. The most important thing really is to chop it up and get it really thoroughly mixed together. And just a small chipper shredder is a wonderful thing to do that. And as you're putting through the material that's going to be shredded, you can also be spraying that material with water, so that, as it comes out, as it's getting mixed together, it's really getting a good dose of water also. Again, just more volume is a great thing. Having at least 2 cubic yards, you're much more likely to reach a PFRP. Adding a little bit of soil or finished compost, it's usually not necessary, but it does tend to give you a bit faster heat up at the front side. Again, keeping the pile moist so that it does feel moist, so that it's not quite at a dripping not quite dripping wet. Turning that material approximately every week definitely will help to keep it aerated and just mix in the materials that haven't yet been decomposed. So if you do some of these things, you're likely to have finished compost within a few months to a year. Again, depending a lot on how much you're willing to put into being active with it. So yeah, doing these procedures to heat it up. Oh, and someone had also asked about substituting synthetic end sources. That does work, yeah. So you can add in, for instance, urea and ammonium sulfate as additional nitrogen sources. You need to be careful, though, that you're not just going to rinse that out. So, you know, those are highly soluble nitrogen sources. And urea can even volatilize, and you know, ammonia can also volatilize very, very easily. So if you are adding those, make sure to get them fully solubilized first, and immediately get those mixed up with your chipped up browns, so that nitrogen gets absorbed you know, into some plant material as quickly as possible. That way you're much less likely to lose the nitrogen, either by volatilizing or through leaching. So yeah, faster composting is much more likely to get hot. And do remember, though, that decomposition happens anyway. But if you aren't meeting a PFRP, you're much more likely to have pathogens and weed seeds persist. Some other very different types of composting that aren't really composting, but you may hear of trench composting. This is really just digging a hole in your garden and putting your food wastes there and covering it up. So clearly, you know, you're not going to have a massive pile, so it's not going to heat up a lot. But it is a really easy way to add those nutrients back into your garden. Clearly, you don't want to put diseased material into your garden soil because it's likely those pathogens will just stay there. But it does get the nutrients back, and it does give some food for worms, and therefore improves the garden soil. So if you're doing proper composting, and I don't know where this green thing came from. I think someone accidentally scribbled on the screen. It's not related to the slide. But if you're doing proper composting, it shouldn't be stinky, definitely should not be on fire or otherwise dangerous. Most of these problems are caused by having too much high energy or high nitrogen materials. And also just a lack of management. And there we go. Vermicomposting is, again, a very different type. Clearly, if you've got worms in your compost, it's not very hot. So this is a style of cool composting, and yet vermicomposting done right produces some wonderful compost, very high quality, and very good at promoting plant health. So vermicomposting can be done very well on small scale too. You just need a good house for your worms, biodegradable bedding, and a consistent supply, though, of food waste. Vermicomposting is kind of a whole other topic, and there are lots of YouTube videos on doing worm bins, and places that you can buy the specialized red wiggler worms, the Eisenia fetida, that love to make you vermicompost. So when is composting done, and when do you actually have compost? Because as we've said, decomposition, it just continues on over time. It doesn't really end until everything is converted to somebody else's body mass or carbon dioxide. So, but when are you ready to use that compost? Well, certainly it's a good sign if you've met a PFRP, but it tends to be, even after you've met PFRP, the compost is not necessarily ready. So as long as it's reheating anytime that you turn it, that tells you that there's still lots of food for the microorganisms, lots of like simple sugars, proteins. So you really want to go long enough that it doesn't just reheat when you turn it. The odor should be very low. It should smell, like topsoil, like finished compost. It definitely should not smell like the raw materials. In commercial facilities, usually they'll have material for at least 3 months. Even a year is not uncommon. WSU Pullman, our campus has a very large composting facility. It's actually a 4-acre facility. And there, for instance, the primary active phase is only about 1 to 2 months, but the material quality improves dramatically if it has a curing stage of 4 to 6 months. So it becomes much more stable, smells much better, and is going to be much higher quality for actually putting onto plants. So once you have compost, all compost is not the same. Thinking about using it, let's look at the verbiage on the bottom here for the big idea. The closer the plant contact in space and time, so the contact between the compost and the plant, then the greater in quality and maturity must be. Lower quality compost can still be used as things like mulch, or less mature compost can be incorporated into soil several months prior to planting. But for instance, if you want compost that you're going to use in potting soil, you're talking about material that you're going to be putting right next to the roots of immature plants, of seedlings. So that needs to be, very mature material, not stuff that is still really actively decomposing, not anything that smells like ammonia when you're putting it next to those little seedlings. So lots of different ways you can use it. Basically, increasing the amount of time or space between the material and plant roots. But good compost is a really wonderful thing. Again, you're adding humic acids to the soil. You're adding nutrients. Often it helps to neutralize soil pH. And let's talk just a little bit about application rates. I wasn't sure if most people would be thinking on kind of small garden sizes or field scale. So if you're doing compost application every year, you're looking at a rate of about 100 pounds to 1,000 pounds for every 1,000 square feet of soil. So on an acre basis, that's up to 20 tons. That's right, up to 20 tons per acre on an annual basis. Often it's more like a 1 to 5 tons per year. Or for an occasional application, you could do up to about 2 tons per 1,000 square feet, which would be up to 100 tons up to 80 to 100 tons per acre. Now that's a heavy rate. You wouldn't want to do that more than, say, every decade. But for instance, if you're coming into a really eroded site, you may need that much material. And keep in mind also that those nutrients are going to come out over time, and particularly the nutrient release is going to be in the summer. So, the great thing and the bad thing about composting is that it stabilizes nutrients. It retains nutrients, but they are more stabilized. So this is an example of nitrogen release from a compost over a 10-year period. And this is actually a pretty rich compost that's releasing about 25% per year. That's about the maximum you can expect from a compost. So if you can envision 200 pounds of compost, that's, that may be, for instance, you can envision your body size. How does that relate to 200 pounds? And if you put that on to soil, you're getting about 2.5 pounds of nitrogen out of that in the first year, or equivalent to what you'd get out of about 20 pounds of blood meal. So, but the next year, you get almost that much again. So again, good thing, bad thing, but important to know that the nutrients come out over time. So that is the basics of composting, and I hope that helped. I think we have just a few more minutes for questions. And